In the early years of the 1800s, war was laying waste to much of Europe, but its effects were spreading far beyond the battlegrounds. One of the more unusual consequences was becoming a threat to the rapidly expanding coalfields in the northeast.
Up until now, the colliery owners had used horses exclusively to transport their coal from their pits down to the rivers. But thousands of horses were being killed in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and that meant that in Britain they were becoming extremely scarce. And that in turn meant that the colliery owners were having to pay vastly more for both horses and their feed. Their solution was both logical and, at first glance, an impossibility. What they needed was a horse that ate coal. I wonder how many of the thousands of passengers who daily travel over High Level Bridge in Newcastle realise that they're passing very near the spot where railway history was made. In the early 1800s, the Winfield Foundry stood here, and it was here that the very first steam locomotive in the northeast was built. The Gateshead engine, as it's known, was constructed to a design by Richard Trevithick. It was very similar to one he built 3 years earlier at Coalbrookdale in Shropshire. Now, it's a great tragedy this little engine did not survive, but there is something still in existence which provides us with a direct link with this hugely important locomotive. So, Jim, you found this in a scrapyard at Bishop Auckland, but it's the one thing we have to connect us with that little engine.
That's right. Winfield's Foundry was the place, not only that this little safe was made in 1813, that magic year of railway innovation, but it was actually produced by that engine. It was built at Winfields by John Steele. John Steele was the first great railway engineer the region knew. He'd worked with Trevithick in Wales and at Coalbrookdale, had worked on his earliest engines, and it was him that came back and said, "You, Mr. Winfield, have got the agency for Trevithick engines in the northeast. Let's not just do stationary ones, let's build a high-pressure one." So he built a high-pressure engine, but it was a speculative build, and the one man who was most interested and possibly going to buy it was Blackett, Christopher Blackett at Wylam. He came along, he saw it run up and down the yard, he said, very interesting, I'll think about this, but he didn't actually buy it. The engine had its wheels taken off, it was set to work blowing the foundry cupola, and it actually smelted down this very metal.
Christopher Blackett was the squire at Wylam. His family had bought the village just a few miles west of Newcastle in the 1600s. Coal had been mined here for at least 900 years. In 1748, the family had laid a wooden wagonway from the riverside colliery 5 miles downstream to Staithes at Leamington, and in 1800, businessman Christopher saw the possibilities and began to look around for ways to develop the family coal business. Slowly but surely, vital elements were coming together to turn Wylam into a crucible of change.
So really, Philip, this pit heap is just about the only substantial remains left of the colliery.
That's right, everything else has disappeared. The colliery closed in 1868 and everything was removed, but obviously the trees have grown over this in the last 130 years.
Of course, we have to say that the real reason for us being here is not to talk about the colliery, but to meet two more of the main players in our story.
Yes, William Headley, the colliery manager at Wylam, and Timothy Hackworth, who was the former of the colliery blacksmiths, were both key figures in the history of locomotive development.
In what way?
It was Headley who came to Wylam in 1804, who later developed Puffing Billy and Wylam Dilly, which are now the two oldest locomotives in the world. And he worked with Timothy Hackworth, who of course was another famous railway engineer in northeast history. He was a very practical man. This was his important contribution there. His father had been the colliery blacksmith and he succeeded to that role, and he had tremendous skills in developing the engineering techniques and working with metals.
We haven't talked a lot about Headley, but he was still a very important figure.
I think a very important man. He is very much overshadowed, unfortunately, by George Stephenson. Tyneside, I think, took to Stephenson and were Geordie mad, if you like, and Headley was rather left out of the picture. But Headley was, again, a very clever man. He trained as colliery viewer and colliery manager. After leaving Wylam in the 1820s, he subsequently acquired shipping interests and colliery interests, quite large colliery interests in Durham. And when he died, he was a very wealthy man.
So really we had Hackworth, Headley, Blackett and Stephenson, all clever men in their own right. What was special about Wylam to make it happen here?
That, I think, is the $64,000 question. I don't know that anybody has the real answer. It is just one of those unique coincidences, I think, that Wylam provided 3 or 4 of the most important figures in early railway history. Perhaps it's something special in the local chemistry.
So really, Philip, any lover of railways from wherever they come in the world would sooner or later have to come here.
Yes, this is very much the Mecca to which all true railway enthusiasts would want to come. This was the birthplace of George Stephenson, popularly known as the father of railways.
But the extraordinary thing is, though, Philip, that small as it is to our eyes, there were 4 families living here.
That's right, and the Stephenson family lived in one ground floor room. There were the 2 parents and certainly 4 of their 6 children were born in Wylam.
A whole family lived just in this one room.
Yes, I think we regard it as severe overcrowding if we had that number of children today living in a room of this size. Very much a slum.
Now, he was the second child in the family, wasn't he? Tell me the story of his early years.
Yes, he was born in 1781 and he spent his first few years of his life in Wylam. We don't know a great deal about what happened then, but I think one of the things he would do would be involved in going down to the pit in the village where his father worked as the colliery fireman, taking his lunch, probably helping to keep his younger brothers and sisters from running onto the nearby wagonway. He would certainly have seen the horses drawing the wagons loaded with coal past the front door.
So young George, coming from a very humble family, would have been destined for a very humble life.
Yes, normally somebody in his position would have had very few career prospects, and certainly his father earned very little, only about 12 shillings a week, which is 40 pence in modern currency. But and he, of course, the difficulty was that the family were so poor that none of the children had any formal education, and it was only when George was 18 or so that he actually was able to go to night school at his own expense and start to learn to read and write.
That shows incredible determination.
Yes, this is, to my mind, one of the great qualities of Stephenson. It was his determination and his self-help. Some people regard him perhaps slightly arrogant at times, but he had this tremendous drive and enthusiasm, I think, which brought success in its end. But it was when they moved from Wylam in 1789 that the family went to Throckley, or near Throckley, when his father got a job at another of the local pits, that George started to become more interested in the mechanical side of engines, the pumping engines associated with the pits.
Which obviously was a curtain raiser for his later work on locomotives.
Absolutely.
So you think he does deserve to be called father of the railways, even though he may have stolen, borrowed other people's ideas?
I don't think there's anyone else to whom that title could be given more effectively. I think Stephenson, he didn't invent the locomotive. That clearly was Richard Trevithick. There were aspects of locomotive development itself which he was not involved with, but he was largely responsible for having the foresight to extend the railway network and using railways as an important means of transport.
Stephenson's greatness is beyond question, but a growing number of people believe we need to readjust our perspective of him.
Jim, we've heard an awful lot about George Stephenson. Does he really deserve all the credit?
No, not all the credit at all. But as you say, the story has become one of Stephenson. Stephenson's story is intertwined with it and was from a very early date. One of the biggest problems we have as historians is that by the middle of the last century, shortly after Stephenson's death, he was already being seen as the father of all railways, the inventor of every aspect of the railway engine. And that has meant that not only have people recorded more about Stephenson himself, they've saved his engines.
So who should we be lifting our hats to?
No single person. Trevithick certainly as the first person to really get the idea of a steam engine on rails. But beyond that, a whole group of people, almost all of them in the northeast. Those who weren't in the northeast were either from the northeast or working for people in the northeast. It is a very, very tight Tyneside development. And this process of writing the history round the survivals is a terrible mistake. We should be careful not to drop into that, particularly when those survivals, such as Stephenson engines, are already being chosen very early on in the last century as icons to the future.
You're not very fond of Stephenson, are you?
I think he does himself no favours looking back into history at being a man who could so easily, at the height of his success and fame, have turned around and said, yes, but there were others and they deserve remembering. Instead, he just nodded and said, gosh, it was nothing. I did it all.
In 1881, this oak tree was planted to commemorate the centenary of George's birth. And you know the saying, from little acorns, great oaks grow. Well, the seeds of the railways had been well and truly planted here at Wylam, and now they were beginning to sprout. Hundreds of vehicles thunder along this busy road through Killingworth on North Tyneside every day, but I wonder how many of the drivers spare a glance at this rather pretty little stone building. Our story now moves here to Dial Cottage, where the Stephenson family moved in 1804. It's actually alleged that George himself made that sundial. But we do know for a fact that in 1812, George was appointed engine wright to the colliery just behind this cottage. And in 1814, with his newfound knowledge and with an eye to what Headley and Hackworth were doing over at Wylam, he persuaded colliery manager Nicholas Wood to allow him to build a locomotive. It was called the Blucher, and it's widely accepted now that it was the first modern type engine.
Blucher outshone all its contemporaries. It could pull 30 tons uphill at 4 miles an hour. As it was said at the time, it was worth 50 horses.
We now come to one of those most crucial moments upon which all our history hinges, and it happened here, in this building in Darlington. It was once the grand home of Edward Pease, a wool merchant and a Quaker, and one of the main backers of plans to build a horse-hauled railway some 40-odd miles from the West Durham coalfield down to the River Tees at Stockton.
Stephenson and Wood, by now convinced that steam locomotives were the key to the future, caught the mail coach to Stockton. The story goes that they walked the 12 miles to Darlington, arriving muddy, tired, and looking for all the world like common labourers. They knocked at Edward Pease's door and came within a whisker of being turned away. But fate had other ideas.
It was this day Edward Pease found himself alone in his house, except for a manservant, and like often a married man, busy man, when he gets all his family safely out of the way, he's started to catch up with all his correspondence. There he was writing letters, and he had the one manservant came, there'd been this knock on the door, on this very door here, and the manservant came up to say, Mr. Pease, there are two gentlemen who wish to speak to you. They say they have some might be of interest to you. First of all, he's saying, I'm not expecting anybody. No. But he was a devout Quaker. The Lord may have sent these men to me for a special purpose. And so they were shown into the kitchen, and they sat round the table, and the outcome was they were from Killingworth Colliery, a Mr. Nicholas Wood and a Mr. George Stephenson.
So Stephenson and Wood were invited in by the manservant and made to wait in this very room.
And Edward Pease came down to talk to them and ask what their business was. They immediately went into his business about these plans for a horse-drawn tramway from his collieries to the northwest of Darlington down to the navigable part of the Tees. And they then asked him if he'd be interested in coming to Killingworth Colliery to see this steam engine which could pull many times the load of a horse.
Well, now, I know this is the story of a locksmith's shop now, but we really can't overestimate the importance in terms of railway history that happened on this very spot. It was crucial, wasn't it?
So much happened as a result of that conversation. The Stockton-Darlington Railway opening, and then a little while after that, Joseph Pease, Edward's son, connected Newcastle to York through Darlington, and then the line spread out over the country.
After this meeting, Pease wrote to his cousin Thomas Richardson the following letter, which conveys so strongly the excitement that he felt. Dear cousin, we should get forward as quick as George Stephenson speaks of, completing the job in 18 months from first opening our ground, and this we expect will be ere this year close. The more we see of Stephenson, the person Gordon names, the more we are pleased with him. He commences the setting out of the line in a few days. He's altogether a self-taught genius, a man thee would be remarkably pleased. Don't be surprised if I tell thee, there seems to us, after careful examination, no difficulty of laying a railroad from London and to Edinburgh, on which wagons would travel and take the mail at the rate of 20 miles per hour. From all this judicious man says, and all we can yet see, no doubt has yet entered my mind, but we shall make a good thing of this concern.
Up to now, the wagonways had used a variety of gauges, that's the distance between the rails. But now Chief Engineer Stephenson had to decide on a gauge for his new Stockton to Darlington railway line. There's an enduring story that he came here to the Roman fort at Housteads on Hadrian's Wall to measure the ancient wheel ruts in the East Gate. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the Romans had trains. These ruts were made by the wheels of ancient carts, and lo and behold, they still measure to an average of 4 feet 8.5 inches, and that eventually became standard gauge for all railways throughout the world. Whatever the truth of the story, it is a fact that in 1823, Pease joined with George Stephenson's son Robert and Bedlington Ironworks owner Michael Longridge to form a company to build steam engines. They constructed workshops at 4th Street in Newcastle, the very first locomotive works in the world.
They were founded on the 23rd of June 1823. George's 19-year-old son Robert became the first working manager. This drawing is the only remaining record of what the works looked like. Today there's little left beyond this window. But it was in this building that two of the most famous early locomotives in the world were built, Locomotion No. 1 and Rocket. And such was the success of those pioneering days that the works swiftly expanded into other buildings in 4th Street.
Well, these were once the offices of the Robert Stephenson and Company works here in 4th Street in Newcastle. And this is a hammer that was actually used in these works in the 1830s. You can still see the logo of the company on the head. It's actually a family treasure, and it belongs to the great-great-grandson of George's brother John, and that's Robert Stephenson Roper. That's been in the family some time then, obviously.
It has, yes.
Was it passed down to you, or did you just find it, or what?
Well, it was inherited from my father and I suppose from his grandmother.
It must be quite something for you to come to this building and know that your great-great-grandfather and Robert must have walked around these very rooms.
Yes, it is indeed, yes, certainly.
So was Robert much like his father George, Bob?
No, I think he was more of an inventor, a greater inventor than his father, and of course he was a greater civil engineer than his father was.
Yeah, of course, we mustn't forget that Robert also built bridges, not just locomotives.
Yes, true, he was a great bridge builder. In fact, many people remember his bridges rather than anything else that he did.
Events were gathering momentum. Work had begun laying the first rails for the new Stockton-Darlington line. George Stephenson had moved on to survey other railways. Robert was in South America. So Timothy Hackworth, in 1824, had been brought in as manager. At the time, hills were a huge obstacle. Locomotives were simply not powerful enough to haul trains up, and tunnels were too costly. The solution was well tried and tested, an overhead winding drum to pull the trucks up one side and lower them down the other.
And indeed, that's what this is at Brusselton, just to the west of Shildon, a conventional rope-hauled incline. In fact, you can still see the old stone sleeper blocks that carried the rails. But down there to the east, on the edge of town, convention ended. If there's anywhere where you could argue that our modern age began, it would have to be here on this footpath through the heart of Shildon. For this used to be the track bed of what we now call the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and it was from this very spot that locomotion set off on that September day all those years ago.
On the morning of the 25th of September 1825, locomotion pulled away, with George Stephenson himself at the controls. Edward Pease wasn't there. His son had died the night before. Locomotion hauled 6 wagons of coal and merchandise, 6 passenger wagons, 14 for workmen, and the company coach for the committee. 2 hours and 9 miles later, she chuffed into Darlington, having achieved an average speed of 8 miles an hour. The 300 on board had swelled to 600, and in Darlington, 12,000 had turned out to welcome her. At 3:45 that afternoon, the train reached Stockton, to be met by 40,000.
For the first time in history, a steam locomotive had hauled passengers on a public railway. I often wonder if George Stephenson and the other pioneers realised what they'd started, and how, from this moment on, the world would never be the same again.